Alright, Andrew here again, and we're going to do chapter 3 lecture. It was assigned pages 87 94, and without further ado, let's get into it. So, this section of the chapter begins with talking about auto-shaping, and auto-shaping was brought to light by Brown and Jenkins in 1968. These two were faced with the task of teaching pigeons to peck a plastic disc, and when they would peck said plastic disc, they would get food. They accomplished this by illuminating said plastic disc for 8 seconds at a time, and then after the 8 seconds, food would dispense into a cup after it. But as the light shined, the pigeons would peck at the disc, auto-shaping this pecking response in them. Now, the pigeon associates them getting food with pecking the disc, not the light that shines on the disc, which is actually what is the precedent to the food dispensing. So instead of the pigeons responding to the light, which predates the food dispensing, the pigeons peck at the disc. That's the response, and ergo they peck at the disc from that point on. Furthermore, there is appetitive conditioning, and through this process, using a rat for an example, a rat is conditioned through a food dispenser and a food cup. And when the rat sticks their snout through a hole in the wall, food will dispense shortly after into the cup. And through repeated trials of this rat sticking its snout through the hole in the wall and then having food dispense, on average, it's about 30 trials, the rat is conditioned to get food this way. It will stick its snout through the wall and food will come out, and that is how it is learned to get food. This process is known as the magazine approach amongst the community. And next we have taste aversion learning. This is basically associating a flavor stimulus with negative physiological side effects, and then which causes the rejection of said flavor stimulus. So if think of any poor tasting food, for example, like poisonous berries taste sour or bitter, and this creates this yuck, gross effect in this yuck, gross response, and that causes you to spit the berries out of your mouth, and likely so, people have evolved to avoid these kinds of foods because if they are not purged from the body, they can lead to sickness and sometimes even death. This is how most animals learn about food, and this is also how babies learn about certain things when they first are interacting with the world. They put things in their mouths, and that's how they interact with the world. The next thing in this section was things that can affect conditioning strength, and one of those things is time. Now, when conditioning, I'll elaborate. The conditioned stimulus occurring before the unconditioned stimulus yields the best results in conditioning. This just makes perfect sense. You know, if you think about how the conditioning process works, you obviously want the conditioned stimulus to trigger the unconditioned stimulus. So obviously, showing the conditioned stimulus or doing the conditioned stimulus before the unconditioned stimulus will eventually result in that conditioned stimulus causing the unconditioned stimulus. Examples of this include delay conditioning, trace conditioning. Another thing that can affect conditioning strength is the subject's first exposure to the conditioned stimulus. And conditioning occurs most rapidly when the conditioned stimulus is first introduced. It just makes sense that way. If you think about when you first learn how to do something, it always catches your interest the most when you first hear about it. Latent inhibition is pre-exposure to the conditioned stimulus prior to conditioning can interfere with the conditioning process. This obviously is just common sense. If you're trying to condition a lab rat with the sound of a bell, but you expose them to the sound of the bell before actually pairing it with unconditioned stimulus, the conditioning process will obviously not be as effective. The unconditioned stimulus pre-exposure effect. Repeated exposure to the unconditioned stimulus alone can reduce its effectiveness as an unconditioned stimulus. Let's see what we have next. Another thing that can affect conditioned strength is the intensity of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus that you're pairing it with. Conditioned stimuluses or stimuli usually have thresholds. For example, if you're using a sound as a conditioned stimulus, a late wind chime or a quiet bell would be a much better choice as a conditioned stimulus than a loud gong or an air horn. This is because louder noises can intimidate the subject or startle the subject, and that's not what you're looking to do in the conditioning process. If you're startling or scaring your subject with the loud conditioned stimulus, it's obviously going to be less effective than a quieter conditioned stimulus. And that's really about it here. All right. See ya.